Jesus has looked lovingly upon each one of us. And in this gaze of his, we may have confidence. When you hear that word confidence, think of courage. Let us not be consumed with haste, as if time dedicated to Christ and silent prayer were time wasted. On the contrary, it is precisely then that the most wonderful fruits of pastoral service come to birth. There is no need to be discouraged on account of the fact that prayer requires effort, or because of the impression that Jesus remains silent. He is silent, but he is at work. In this regard, I'm pleased to recall my experience last year in Kolbe. I witnessed then a deep, unforgettable silence of 1 million young people at the moment of the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. That prayerful silence united us. It gave us great consolation. In a world where there is so much noise, so much bewilderment, there is a need for silent adoration of Jesus concealed in the host. Be assiduous in the prayer of adoration and teach it to the faithful. It is a source of comfort and light, particularly for those who are suffering. Then the Pope goes on to say this, a very profound paragraph. The faithful expect only one thing from priests, that they be specialists in promoting the encounter between man and God. The priest is not asked to be an expert in economics, construction, or politics. Think of pastor. He's expected to be an expert in the spiritual life. With this end in view, when a young priest takes his first steps, he needs to be able to refer to an experienced teacher who will help him not to lose his way among the many ideas put forward by the culture of the moment. In the face of the temptations of relativism or the permissive society, there is absolutely no need for the priest to know the latest changing currents of thought. What the faithful expect from him is that he be a witness to the eternal wisdom contained in the revealed world. Solicitude for the quality of personal prayer and for good theological formation bear fruit in life. And then he speaks about their situation of communism in Poland. Living under the influence of totalitarianism may have given rise to an unconscious tendency to hide under an external mask, and in consequence, to become somewhat hypocritical. Clearly, this does not promote authentic fraternal relations and may lead to an exaggerated concentration on oneself. Listen to this one. In reality, we grow in effective maturity when our hearts adhere to God. Christ needs priests who are mature, virile, capable of cultivating an authentic spiritual paternity. And for this to happen, priests need to be honest with themselves, open with their spiritual director, and trusting in divine mercy. Now that confidence that Pope Benedict spoke about to the priests of Warsaw is what John Paul II explicitly calls the courage of the truth of our priesthood. John Paul II says the courage of this truth, loving gaze of Christ, is the seal placed upon us at ordination. By its very nature, therefore, our vocation is missionary. The priest is a man who is sent on mission from God, sharing in this apostolic ministry. The priest shares in the apostles' special friendship with Jesus Christ. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is about. Instead, I have called you friends, for I have made known to you all that I have heard from my Father. The priest is a friend of Jesus Christ, and he knows and shares in the mission that the Father sent Christ to do. Brothers, what John Paul II and Pope Benedict are telling us in these exhortations to priests is the priesthood is first and foremost a supernatural job. And it requires prayer and successful daily effort of attention to God. When we were each ordained priests, we were reminded to consider carefully the nature of the rank in the church to which we were about to be raised. Now, in light of that particular statement, there's two extremes we should avoid. One is the extreme of false superiority that gives rise to clericalism. But the other extreme is a reductionist tendency to see no difference between ordained priesthood and that egalitarian view of other ministries in the church. We need to remember that our status as priests of Jesus Christ is not granted to us because of who we are, but rather because the world must recognize Christ in us and through our ministry. And that's why in these days of retreat, I ask you to focus on heroic priestly examples of holiness and virtue. Pope Francis, in his apostolic exhortation, Joy of the Gospel, speaks of this courage that's necessary and expressed in mission when he opened with this simple line: "The joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew." In this exhortation, I wish to encourage the Christian faithful to embark on a new chapter of evangelization, marked by this joy, while pointing out new paths for the church's journey in years to come. And then the Pope went on later. I'm sure you remember this other section because it's been quoted so often. But this is where the Pope was calling forth a real courage among us as pastors and priests. When the Pope spoke about this, he said, "I dream of a missionary option, that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation." Now, that's a huge statement. What the Pope is calling for is a courageous approach to our priesthood that allows us to face challenges in a new way. A way that may be unpredictable, may be new, may be unknown. To do that takes the confidence of knowing God's grace in our lives and trusting it. Think about those priestly examples who have shown you what it means to be a witness of that courage, that confidence, that abiding endurance of God's presence, especially in the midst of difficult situations. You all know the story of Maximilian Kolbe, I presume. His story is one that I grew up with in Catholic grade school. But Maximilian Kolbe has always been, I think, a very wonderful image of priestly fidelity and courage. So, to summarize his story, it was 1941. Maximilian Kolbe was in Auschwitz, and 3 prisoners escaped. In exchange for that, 10 other prisoners would have to die in place of that. And one man protested, pleaded for mercy, and because his wife and family needed him. And he asked to be relieved of that sentence of death. Maximilian came forward, drawing the attention of the commandant, of the commandant, who asked him, "Who are you?" And Maximilian Kolbe's answer was simply this: "I am a Catholic priest." Now that was his self-identification as a priest, not someone who was defiant and self-righteous. Namely, you don't dare kill me, I'm a Catholic priest. Nor was it the self-surrender of a hollow man who was beaten down and knew that he had been overcome by his situation. Let's just get it over with. I'm a Catholic priest. I'm going to die here anyway. It was not a capitulation to a conquering soldier who hated priests and had lost his own relationship to God. Nor was it primarily a fraternal moment of unity with so many other priests who were dying in the hell of those moments of the concentration camps. Maximilian Kolbe's answer was a statement of unity with one priest, and that is one and only priest, who himself had walked with barbarous and cruel men centuries before. The priest who died not to take one person's place, but the priest who died for all of humanity's place. And that is the priest, Jesus Christ. Maximilian Kolbe offered his life for someone else because that's what Jesus did. And that's what Catholic priests do in one way or another every day. It's fundamental to our identity. As he died in that camp of Auschwitz, thinking that his life would be erased to memory, he becomes a great saint and a great example for all of us of what the courage of priesthood really looks like. And that's especially true when it comes to living that courage of priesthood in the daily grind. Because that's the martyrdom most of us are going to experience. You know, we will die of paper cuts before we will die in a concentration camp. But Teresa of Avila had a wonderful statement. She said, it takes more courage for an imperfect human being to pursue the way of perfection than it does to suddenly become a martyr. It takes more courage for an imperfect human being to pursue the way of perfection day in and day out than it does to suddenly become a martyr. Retreat is a good time to refocus on our self-identification. I am a Catholic priest, ordained to embody the very presence of Jesus, a high priest. That requires a very deep self-abandonment that we just prayed with the words of Charles de Foucault. A visceral and deep-seated acknowledgement of our need for God, of God's fidelity to us, and of our willingness to be faithful in return. No matter what our gifts are, what our abilities are, what our training is, everything is a gift from God. And the Lord asks us to generously and freely place that in the service of his people. Cardinal Suhard, speaking to priests, reminded them of this need to be courageous witnesses of Christ's presence when he said this: it is fitting for priests to become witnesses again, not so much to convince people as to serve as a sign for them. It has been truly said that to be a witness does not consist in engaging in propaganda or even in stirring people up, but in being a living mystery. It means to live in such a way that one's life would not make sense if God did not exist. And so I just want to conclude our talk today by reflecting on what Cardinal Suhard said about the power of being a witness, being a living mystery, being someone who actually, whose life doesn't make sense if God doesn't exist. And I invite you in a very particular way also to think about who are the priests who showed that to you. What it meant meant to be authentically a friend of Jesus and to be called to that deep commitment to him. So you see this image over here. I'll explain this image in just a moment. But one of the experiences that I had of priestly examples in my own life was what I would call a very providential experience as I was a college freshman. And I had gone to college with the explicit purpose of convincing God he didn't want me to be a priest. Because as I was thinking about priesthood, I had pretty much resolved that that's not what I was going to do. And so I was very much committing myself to the secular college experience. But at the end of my freshman year of college, my aunt and uncle were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in a very small town, farming community of western Oklahoma. And they asked if I would serve Mass for their 50th anniversary. Now, there's nothing more uncool for a college student to do than to serve Mass, but I agreed to do that. As I was in the sacristy preparing for the Mass, a priest came into the sacristy. He wasn't the pastor, and he wasn't a priest I'd ever met. But he had a presence to him that was profoundly spiritual. And it was a tangible presence of the Holy Spirit. He possessed a peace, a joy, and a quiet sense of love that actually permeated that room. It changed that room. And I noticed that as a college freshman. So as I'm serving the Mass and he's celebrating at the altar, I'm very fascinated. And I'm saying, why does this person have the qualities that I'm looking for, but I'm not finding, running from priesthood? And yet this person is a priest. And it was in the course of serving that Mass that I decided that I would once again be open to the possibility of being a priest. That's the power of witness. It wasn't anything he did or anything that he said. It was the power of a life committed to Christ. The power of being on fire with love of God and in deep friendship with Jesus. And that presence impacted me. After Mass, I asked my parents, who was that priest? And they said, that is Father Stanley Rother. He's the missionary in Guatemala. Now, 4 months later, he was martyred. And in 2017, he became the first American-born priest to be beatified by Pope Francis. He did a lot of great things in his ministry. He went to a mission in Santiago, Guatemala. He had 25,000 people in his parish. And within 6 years of his arrival, 7 years of his arrival, he was the only priest there. He helped them care for the people by building healthcare clinics, schools, establishing agricultural co-ops, weaving co-ops, banking systems, catechetical programs, radio stations. You go on down the line. He did a lot, and he died as a martyr. But I didn't know any of that when I met him. I only knew that this is a man who has given his life to Christ and has found joy and peace in that gift, in that relationship. That's the power of witness. Who are the priests who have shown you the beauty of divine friendship with Jesus? I tell that story, that was my freshman year of college. And yet, I still had a lot of discernment to do. As I approached my senior year of college, I was pretty much sure that God wanted me to be a priest, but I just couldn't overcome the sacrifices and the fears. I kept thinking, what if it doesn't work? What if I'm not happy? What if I can't do it? What if I fail? What if celibacy becomes overwhelming? All of those fears were robbing me of the courage it took to be able to say yes. And as I was going through those last fears that I had to overcome, but I couldn't find a way to overcome them. Some friends and I, fellow geology students, were going for a one-week stay in Colorado, and we decided to go to the top of Mount Antero. My friends didn't know that I was discerning priesthood, but we decided to go to the top of Mount Antero, just south of Leadville, which, if you're familiar with it, is one of the 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado. And on the top of Mount Antero, they have naturally occurring deposits of aquamarines. So we were going to go find our treasure in aquamarines as college seniors. And we spent 3 days on top of Mount Antero. We didn't find anything. Finally, the third day, and it's our last day, we get up and we're a little bit, dizzy. You could call it altitude sickness or a hangover from college seniors, whatever. But we're going out again for our final time. And as we're going and we're walking across that mountainside, I fall. And I slip and fall down about 8 feet down a slope. And as I'm getting up and I'm on my knees, that's when I look in front of me in the mountainside, and there in a crevice is a perfectly formed 19-karat aquamarine crystal. But what I realized in that moment is that I couldn't see it when I was standing up. I could only see it when I was on my knees. And suddenly I realized that's why I couldn't overcome those fears. That's why I couldn't find the courage to embrace the sacrifice. Because I was trying to solve that problem standing up rather than on my knees. And that's when I began to go and to offer that to the Lord. And that's when I began to realize that only in prayer can we ever know the reality of Christ's presence with us in our daily struggles. And that presence, reassuring us that we're not alone, actually invites us into a sharing of the cross. And that every time we're invited to share in the cross of Jesus, that's an invitation into divine friendship. And that's the gem that I couldn't see when I was standing up. I could only see it on my knees. That's the gem that is in the pectoral cross that I wear. This is not a piece of jewelry. This is a reminder to me every day that if I'm going to be faithful as a bishop, and I'm going to fulfill the ministry that Jesus gave to me, I have to do it by starting my day on my knees. And that's what I do. That's where I find the courage to entrust my day to the Lord, to accept that invitation to divine friendship, especially when it means a sharing in the cross, and to just offer it to the Lord. So I share that with you because that's another lesson, another grace that the Lord gave me in a very foundational way. And it continues to focus and to shape the way that I experience challenges, especially today. And I'm sure you experience those also in your ministry in all sorts of ways. The rest of the story, by the way, we came down from the mountain, went to a gem shop, and asked, how much can we get for that? And the guy said, I'll give you $1,000 for it. Now, to a college senior in 1983, that's a lot of beer. But something inside me had happened right there. And what had happened in me is that I had suddenly had a breakthrough in my ability to say yes to Jesus. So that was much more than 1,000 words. But I also thought to myself, who knows, maybe someday I will be a priest. And if I'm a priest, I might be a bishop. And I'm going to put that in my cross if I am. So 35 years later, it is. Let us pray together. Lord, teach me to be generous. Teach me to serve you as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labor and not to ask for reward, save that of knowing that I do your will. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, forever.
By the way, I placed this week's retreat under the patronage of Blessed Stanley Rother. So there is a first-class relic from his grip, which is here as well. And I think the Bishop Tony Taylor had given one of your days of recollection for Holy Thursday. Is that correct?